From Castle Rexworth and the Rexworth Estates, I bid you good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are. My name is Rexworth, Lord Rexworth, and I welcome you to Friday night's stream. Going to be doing some reading ASMR, continuing our readings of the book Follow the Saint by Leslie Charteris. If you haven't heard the previous versions of this, we've had about, I think, 2 weekly episodes. Past 2 weeks we've been working on this. So feel free to go back and watch the VODs. They are available on my YouTube channel, which you can access along with all of my links by going to lordrexworth.com. That is lordrexworth.com. That's the website. Also, got the Throne-powered shop. You can support his lordship through purchases at the Throne Shop just by going to lordrexworth.store. That is lordrexworth.store. These are items that have been specially curated by yours truly, and they also and for which I will receive a small commission. Now, let's see. Also, speaking of Throne, I would be remiss if I did not put that up as well. Gifts are always appreciated, but never required by his lordship. Do check out my Throne page by logging on to throne.com/Lord Rexworth. The link is there in the chat. And let's see, what else is there? Oh yes, do give me a follow on Twitter. I do tend to tweet along with the rest of the twits out there on Twitter, in Twitterland and Xland. Follow his lordship on Twitter by going to twitter.com/Lord Rexworth. Let's see, tonight's program is brought to you in... Oh, wait. Before I do that, let me go ahead and put out the tip jar. I need to get better about doing that. You can support me directly with a donation via Stream Elements. You can click that link there in the chat, streamelements.com/Lord Rexworth/tip. Just click that link there in chat. That'll take you to the tip jar. Tips, again, like the gifts on the Throne page, not required, but certainly they are most deeply appreciated. Tonight's program is brought to you by Dubby. What is Dubby? Well, if you're a frequent visitor to our program, perhaps you might have heard about it. If you're new here, let me explain. Dubby is an energy drink that you can mix at home with no jitters, no crash, only about $1 per serving. Better than what you can find at the coffee shops these days. And Dubby was formulated to give you focus and energy with no jitters or crash. The formula contains vitamins, amino acids, nootropics, including the patented neurofactor. Dubby contains no calories, no sugar, no maltodextrin, no fillers, no artificial colors, no rubbish, no nonsense. So try Dubby today by logging on to dubby.gg or click that link there in the chat and use the code LordRexworth at checkout. You'll get 10% off your order when you use the code LordRexworth, all one word, at checkout. Just go to dubby.gg or click that link there in the chat and then use the code LordRexworth at checkout for 10% off your order. Dubby. Be better. We are also brought to you tonight by the Cash App. Try the Cash App today using my code. We will both get $5 when you link a new bank account and send $5. Just click that link there in the chat to download the Cash App. It's available on iOS and Android devices. And then we're also brought to you tonight by Wise. What is Wise, you might ask? Well, it is the smarter way to send and receive money and hold multiple currencies compared to using traditional banking. Most people run into the issue of hefty conversion fees and ATM charges when traveling. Some banks like to charge as much as 3% here in the United States just for their account holders to convert from US dollars to the local currency wherever they're traveling internationally. Well, the Wise multi-currency account and debit card will help to solve that problem. You can convert money before your trip at the mid-market exchange rate plus a small upfront fee, and then when you reach your travel destination, you just pay with your Wise debit card or withdraw at ATMs, and you get free withdrawals up to $250 each month. Best of all, no foreign transaction fees. That is a point of pride and also quite helpful, especially if you are an international traveler such as myself. So when traveling abroad, consider Wise. With a multi-currency account and debit card, you can spend and withdraw money in over 40 currencies from local ATMs, and it's much cheaper than using your local bank. Click that link there in chat and open your Wise account now. Right, with all of that out of the way, let's get back to our readings of Follow the Saint. We are into the story called The Invisible Millionaire. Left you on a bit of a cliffhanger on that one. But here it is, Chapter 5. And let me make sure I've got my hydration here at the ready. Because I can feel that I'm going to need it quite frequently with these reading ASMR streams. Right, The Invisible Millionaire by Leslie Charteris, Chapter 5. He listened with tingling detachment while Rosemary Chase talked and answered questions. The dead girl's father was a man who had known and helped Marvin Chase when they were both young, but who had long ago been left far behind by Marvin Chase's sensational rise in the financial world. When Prescott's own business was failing, Chase had willingly lent him large sums of money, but the failure had not been averted. Illness had finally brought Prescott's misfortunes to the point where he was not even able to meet the interest on the loan. And when he refused further charity, Chase had sent him to Switzerland to act as an entirely superfluous representative in Zurich and had given Nora Prescott a job himself. She had lived more as one of the family than as an employee. No, she had given no hint of having any private troubles or even been afraid of anyone. Only she had not seemed to be quite herself since Marvin Chase's motor accident. The bare supplementary facts clicked into place in the framework that was already there, as if into accurately fitted sockets, filling in sections of the outline without making much of it more recognizable. They filed themselves away in the saint's memory with mechanical precision, and yet the closeness which he felt to the mystery that hid behind them was more intuitive than methodical, a weird sensitivity that sent electric shivers coursing up his spine. A gray-haired, ruddy-cheeked doctor arrived and made his matter-of-fact examination and report. 3 stab wounds in the chest. I'll be able to tell you more about them after I've made the post-mortem, but I should think that any one of them might have been fatal. Slight contusions on the throat. Has been dead much more than an hour. He stood glancing curiously over the other faces. "Where's that ambulance?" said the sergeant grumpily. "They've probably gone to the house," said the girl. "I'll send them down if I see them. You don't want us getting in your way anymore, do you?" "No, miss, this is very pleasant for you, I suppose. This isn't very pleasant for you, I suppose. If I want any more information, I'll come up and see you in the morning. Will Mr. Forrest be there if we want to see him?" Forrest took a step forward. "Wait a minute," he blurted. "You haven't—" "They aren't suspicious of you, Jim," said the girl, with a quiet firmness. "They might just want to ask some questions." "But you haven't said anything about Templars." "Of course." The girl's interruption was even firmer. Her voice was still quiet and natural, but the undercurrent of determined warning in it was as plain as a siren to the saint's ears. "I know we owe Mr. Templar an apology, but we don't have to waste Sergeant Jesser's time on it. Perhaps he'd like to come up to the house with us and have a drink. That is, if you don't need him anymore, Sergeant." "Val, welcome in. Good to have you here." Her glance only released the young man's eye after it had pinned him to perplexed and scowling silence. And once again Simon felt that premonitory crisping of his nerves. "Well, all this excitement certainly does dry out the tonsils," he remarked easily. "But if Sergeant Jesser wants me to stay—" "No, sir." The reply was calm and ponderous. "I made a note of your address, and I don't think you could run away. You're going home tonight. You might try the bell first in case we decide to stop over." Simon buttoned his coat and strolled toward the door with the others, but as they reached it, he stopped and turned back. "By the way," he said blandly, "do you mind if we take our lawful artillery?" The sergeant gazed at him and dug the guns slowly out of his pocket. Simon handed one of them to Mr. Uniatz and leisurely fitted his own automatic back into the spring holster under his arm. His smile was very slight. "Since there still seems to be a murderer at large in the neighborhood," he said, "I'd like to be ready for him." As he followed Rosemary Chase and Jim Forrest up a narrow footpath away from the river, with Hoppy Uniatz beside him and the butler bringing up the rear, he grinned inwardly over that delicately pointed line, and wondered whether it had gone home where he intended it to go. Since his back had been turned to the real audience, he had been unable to observe the reaction, and now their backs were turned to him in an equally uninformative reversal. Neither of them said a word on the way, and Simon placidly left the silence to get tired of itself. But his thoughts were very busy as he sauntered after them along the winding path and saw the lighted windows of a house looming up through the thinning trees that had hidden it from the riverbank. This, he realized with a jolt, must be the new manor, and therefore the boathouse where Nora Prescott had been murdered was presumably a part of Marvin Chase's property. It made no difference to the facts, but the web of riddle seemed to draw tighter round him. They crossed the lawn and mounted some steps to a flagged terrace. Rosemary Chase led them through open French windows into an inoffensively furnished drawing room, and the butler closed the windows behind him as he followed. Forrest threw himself sulkily into an armchair, but the girl had regained a composure that was just a fraction too detailed to be natural. "What kind of drinks would you like?" he asked. "Beer for me," said the saint, with the same studied urbanity. "Scotch for Hoppy. I'm afraid I should have warned you about him. He likes to have his own bottle. We're trying to wean him, but it isn't going very well." The butler bowed and oozed out. The girl took a cigarette from an antique lacquer box, and Simon stepped forward politely with his lighter. He had an absurd feeling of unreality about this new atmosphere that made it a little difficult to hide a sense of humor, but all his senses were vigilant. She was even lovelier than he had thought her at first sight. He admitted him to himself as he watched her face over the flame. It was hard to believe that she might be an accomplice to willful and messy and apparently mercenary murder. But she and Forrest had certainly chosen a very dramatic moment to arrive. "It's nice of you to have us here," he murmured, "after the way we've behaved." "My father told me to bring you up," she said. "He seems to be quite an admirer of yours, and he was sure you couldn't have had anything to do with the murder." "I noticed, down in the boathouse, you knew my name," said the saint thoughtfully. "Yes, the sergeant used it." Simon looked at the ceiling. "Right lads, these policemen, aren't they? I wonder how he knew." "From your gun license, I suppose." Simon nodded. "Oh, yes. But before that, I suppose he must have told your father who I was. Nobody else could have done it, could they?" The girl reddened and lost her voice, but Forrest found his. He jerked himself angrily out of his chair. "What's the use of all this beating about the bush, Rosemary?" he demanded impatiently. "Why don't you tell him what we know all about that letter Nora wrote him?" The door opened and the butler came back with a tray of bottles and glasses and toured the room with them. There was a strained silence until he had gone again. Hoppy Uninat stared at the newly opened bottle of whiskey which had been put down in front of him with a rapt and menacing expression, which indicated that his grey matter was in the throes of another paroxysm of thought. Simon raised his glass and gazed appreciatively at the sparkling brown clearness within it. "All right," he said, "if you want it that way. So you knew Nora Prescott had written to me. Came to the bell to see what happened. Probably you watched through the windows first, and then when she went out, you came in to watch me. You followed one of us to the boathouse. And we ought to have told the police, of course." The saint's voice was mild and friendly. "You ought to have told them about the letter. I'm sure you could have quoted what was in it. Something about how she was being forced to help in putting over a gigantic fraud, and how she wanted me to help her." Sergeant Jesser would have been wild with excitement about that. Naturally, he'd have seen at once that provided an obvious motive for me to murder her, and none at all for the guy whose fraud was going to be given away. It really was pretty noble of you both to take so much trouble to keep me out of suspicion, and I appreciate it a lot. And now that we're all pals together, and there aren't any policemen in the audience, why don't you save me a lot of headaches and tell me what the swindle is?" The girl stared at him. "Do you know what you're saying?" "I usually have a rough idea," said the saint coolly and deliberately. "I'll make it even plainer, if it's too subtle for you. Your father's a millionaire, they tell me. And when there are any gigantic frauds in the wind, I never expect to find the big shots sitting in a garret toasting kippers over a candle." Forrest started towards him. "Look here, Templar, we've stood about enough from you, and I've stood plenty from you," said the saint without moving. "Let's call it quits. We were both misunderstanding each other at the beginning. We don't have to go on doing it. I can't do anything for you if you don't put your cards on the table. So let's straighten it out now. Which of you two cooled off Nora Prescott?" He didn't seem to change his voice, but the question came with a sharp, stinging clarity, like the flick of a whip. Rosemary Chase and the young man gaped at him frozenly, and he waited for an answer without a shift of his lazily negligent eyes. But he didn't get it. The rattle of the door handle made everyone turn, almost in relief at the interruption. A tall, cadaverous man, severely dressed in a dark suit and high old-fashioned collar, his chin bordered with a rim of black beard, pince-nez on a loop of black ribbon in his hand, came into the room and paused hesitantly. Rosemary Chase came slowly out of her trance. "Oh, Dr. Quintus," she said in a quiet, forced voice. "This is Mr. Templar and Hoppy Uniats," Simon supplied. Dr. Quintus bowed, and his black, sunken eyes clung for a moment to the saint's face. "Delighted," he said in a deep, burring bass, and turned back to the girl. Miss Chase, I'm afraid the shock has upset your father a little. Nothing at all serious, I assure you, but I think it would be unwise for him to have any more excitement just yet. However, he asked me to invite Mr. Templar to stay for dinner. Perhaps later. Simon took another sip at his beer, and his glance swung idly over to the girl with the first glint of a frosty sparkle in its depths. We'd be delighted, he said depreciatingly, if Miss Chase doesn't object. Why, of course not. Her voice was only the minutest shred of a decibel out of key. We'd love to have you stay. The saint smiled at his courteous acceptance, ignoring the wrathful half-movement that made Forrest's attitude rudely obvious. He would have stayed anyway, whoever had objected. It was just dawning on him that out of the whole fishy setup, Marvin Chase was the one man he had still to meet. Chapter 6. Boss, said Mr. Unietz, rising to his feet with an air of firm decision. Shall I go to the toilet? It was not possible for Simon to pretend that he didn't know him, nor could he take refuge in temporary deafness. Mr. Unietz's penetrating accents were far too peremptory for that to have been convincing. Simon swallowed and took a hold of himself with the strength of despair. I don't know, Hoppy, he said bravely. How do you feel? I feel fine, boss. Just thought it might be a good place. It might be, Simon conceded feverishly. That was a swell idea of yours, boss, said Mr. Unietz, hitching up his bottle. Simon took hold of the back of a chair for support. Oh, not at all, he said faintly. It's nothing to do with me. Hoppy looked puzzled. Sure, you thought of it first, boss. He insisted generously. You said to me the next time I should take the bottle away from some place and lock myself with it. So, thought I might take this one in the toilet. Just thought it might be a good place, said Mr. Unietz, rounding off the resume of his train of thought. Sit down, said the saint, with paralyzing ferocity. Mr. Unietz lowered himself back onto his hams with an expression of pained mystification, and Simon turned to the others. Excuse us, won't you? He said brightly. Hoppy's made a sort of bet with himself about something. He's rather a one-track mind. Horace glared at him coldly. Rosemary put on a half-gracious smile and took it off again. Dr. Quintus almost bowed with his mouth open. There was a lot of silence in which Simon could feel the air prickling with the pardonable speculations on his sanity. Every other reaction that he had been deliberately building up to provoke had had time to disperse itself under cover of the two consecutive interruptions. The spell was shattered. He was back again where he began. He knew it, and he resignedly slid into small talk that might yet lead to another opening. I heard that your father had a nasty motor accident, Miss Chase, he said. Yes. The brief monosyllable offered nothing but the baldest affirmation, but her eyes were fixed on him with an expression that he tried unavailingly to read. I hope he wasn't badly hurt. Quite badly burned, rumbled the doctor. The car caught fire, you know, but fortunately his life wasn't in danger. In fact, he could probably have escaped with nothing worse than a few bruises. We hadn't made such heroic efforts to save his secretary, who was trapped in the wreckage. Yes, I read something about it, lied the saint. He was burned to death, wasn't he? What was his name now? Bertrand Templin. Oh, yes, of course. Celeste, welcome in. Simon took a cigarette from his case and lighted it. He looked at the girl. His brain was still working at fighting pitch, but his manner was quite casual and disarming now. The unruffled conversational manner of an accepted friend discussing a minor matter of mutual interest. I just remembered something you said to the sergeant a little while ago, Miss Chase, about having noticed that Nora Prescott seemed to be rather under a strain since Tamberlin was killed. Been here from the beginning. Oh, thank you, Celeste, for lurking up until now. But thank you for checking in. I just, whenever I first see somebody post something, I tend to almost reflexively tell them welcome in. She looked back at him steadily, neither denying it nor encouraging him. He said in the same sensible, persuasive way, I was wondering whether you noticed them being particularly friendly before the accident, as if there was any kind of attachment between them. He saw the eyes of both Forrest and Dr. Quintus turn toward the girl, as if they both had an unexpectedly intense interest in her answer, but she looked at neither of them. I can't be sure, she answered, as though choosing her words carefully. Their work brought them together all the time, of course. Mr. Tamblyn was really Father's private secretary and almost his other self. And when Norda came to us, she worked for Mr. Tamblyn nearly as much as Father. I thought sometimes Mr. Tamblyn was, well, quite keen on her, but I don't know whether she responded. Of course, I didn't ask her. You don't happen to have a picture of Tamblyn, do you? I think there's a snapshot somewhere. She stood up and went over to an inlaid writing table and rummaged in the drawer. It might have seemed fantastic that she should do that, obeying the saint's suggestion, as if he had hypnotized her. But Simon knew just how deftly he had gathered up the threads of his broken dominance and woven them into a new pattern. If the scene had to be played in that key, it suited him as well as any other. And with that key established, such an ordinary and natural request as he had made could not be refused. But he noticed that Dr. Quintus followed her with his hollow black eyes all the way across the room. Here. Just got here, didn't want to interrupt the story, but hello. Hey, action! Welcome in. Welcome in. She gave Simon a commonplace Kodak print that showed two men standing on the steps of a house. One of them was apparently of medium height, a little flabby, greyed-haired in the small areas of his head where he was not bald. The other was a trifle shorter and leaner, with thick, smooth black hair and metal-rimmed glasses. The saint touched his forefinger on the picture of the older man. Your father? Yes. It was a face without any outstanding features, creased in a tolerant, if somewhat calculating smile. But Simon knew how deceptive a face could be, particularly in that kind of reproduction. And the first thought that was thrusting itself forward in his mind was that there were two people dead, not only one. Two people who had held similar, closely associated jobs, who from the very nature of their employment must have shared a good deal of Marvin Chase's confidence and known practically everything about his affairs. Two people who must have known more about the intricate details of his business life than anyone else around him. One question clanged in the saint's head like a deep, jarring bell. Was Nora Prescott's killing the first murder to which that unknown swindle had led, or only the second? All through dinner his brain echoed the complex repercussions of the explosive idea, under this screen of superficial conversation which lasted through the meal. It gave that part of the evening a macabre spookiness. Hoppy Oninuts, hurt and frustrated, toyed half-heartedly with his food, which is to say he did not ask for more than 2 helpings of any one dish. From time to time he washed down a mouthful with a gulp from the bottle which he had brought in with him, and put it down again to leer at it malevolently, as if it had personally welched on him. Simon watched him anxiously when he seemed to lean perilously close to the candles which lighted the table, thinking that it would not take much to cause his breath to ignite and burn with a blue flame. Forrest had given up his efforts to protest at the whole procedure. He ate most of the time in sulky silence, and when he spoke at all, he made a point of turning as much of his back to the saint as his place at the table allowed. Plainly, he'd made up his mind Simon Templar was a cad on whom good manners would be wasted. Rosemary Chase talked very little, but she spoke to the saint when she spoke at all, and she was watching him all the time with enigmatic intentness. Dr. Quintus was the only one who helped to shoulder the burden of maintaining an exchange of urbane trivialities. His reverberant basso bumbled obligingly into every conversational opening, and said nothing that was worth remembering. His eyes were like pools of basalt at the bottom of dry caverns, never altering their expression, yet always moving, slowly, in a way that seemed to keep everyone under ceaseless surveillance. Simon chatted genially and emptily, with faintly mocking calm. He'd shown his claws once. Now it was up to the other side to take up the challenge in their own way. The one thing they could not possibly do was ignore it, and he was ready to wait with timeless patience for their lead. Under his pose of idle carelessness, it was like an arrow on a drawn bow with ghostly fingers balancing the string. Forrest excused himself as they left the dining room. Quintus came as far as the drawing room but did not sit down. He pulled out a large gold watch and consulted it with impressive deliberation. "I'd better have another look at the patient," he said. "He may have settled down again by now." The door closed behind him. Simon leaned himself against the mantelpiece. Except for the presence of Mr. Uniatsu, who in these circumstances was no more obtrusive than a piece of primitive furniture, he was alone with Rosemary Chase for the first time since so many things had begun to happen. And he knew she was also aware of it. She kept her face averted from his tranquil gaze, taking out a cigarette and lighting it for herself with impersonal unapproachability, while he waited. And then suddenly, she turned on him as if her own restraint had defeated itself. "Well," she said, with self-consciously harsh defiance, "what are you thinking after all this time?" The saint looked her in the eyes. His own voice was contrastingly even and aggressive. "Thinking," he said, "that you're either a very dangerous crook or just a plain damn fool. But hoping you're just a plain damn fool, and hoping that if that's the answer, it won't be much longer before your brain starts working again. You hate crooks, don't you?" "Yes." "I've heard about you," she said. "You don't care what you do to anyone you think is a crook. You've even killed them." "I've killed rats," he said, "and I'll probably do it again. It's the only treatment that's any good for what they've got." "Always?" Simon shrugged. "Listen," he said, not unkindly. "If you want to talk theories, we can have a lot of fun, but we shan't get very far. If you want me to admit that there are exceptions to my idea of justice, you can take it as admitted, but we can't go on from there without getting down to cases. I can tell you this, though. I've heard that there's something crooked being put over here, and from what's happened since, it seems to be true. I'm going to find out what the swindle is and break it up, even if it takes 50 years. Only it won't take me nearly as long as that. Now, if you know something that you're afraid to tell me because of what it might make me do to you or to somebody else who matters to you, all I can say is that it'll probably be a lot worse if I have to dig it out for myself. Is that any use?" She moved closer towards him, her brown eyes searching his face. "I wish—" It was all she had time to say. The rush of sounds that cut her off hit both of them at the same time, muffled by distance and the closed door of the room, and yet horribly distinct, stiffening them both together as though they had been clutched by invisible, clammy tentacles. A shrill, incoherent yell, hysterical with terror, but unmistakably masculine. A heavy thud, a wild shout of "Help!" in the doctor's deep, thundery voice, and then a ghastly, inhuman, wailing gurgle that choked off into deathly silence. Chapter 7. Balanced on a knife edge of uncanny self-control, the saint stood motionless, watching the girl's expression for a full long second before she turned away with a gasp and rushed to the door. Hoppy Oniats flung himself after her like a wild bull awakened from slumber. He could have remained comatose through aeons of verbal fencing, but this was a call to action, clear and unsullied, and such simple clarions had never found his unresponsive. Simon started the thin edge of an instant later than either of them, but it was his hand that reached the doorknob first. He threw the door wide and stepped out with a smooth combination of movements that brought him through the opening with a gun in his hand and his eyes streaking over the entire scene outside in one whirling survey. But the hall was empty. At the left and across from him, the front door was closed. At the opposite end, a door which obviously communicated with the service wing of the house was thrown open to disclose the portly emerging figure of the butler with the white, frightened faces of other servants peering from behind him. The saint's glance swept on upwards. The noises that had brought him out had come from upstairs, he was certain. That was also the most likely place for them to have come from, and it was the only habitual caution that had made him pause to scan the hall as he reached it. He caught the girl's arm as she came by to him. "Let me go up first," he said. He blocked Hoppy's path on his other side and shot a question across at the butler without raising his voice. "Any other stairs, Jeeves?" Yes, sir." "All right, you stay here with Miss Chase. Hoppy, you find those back stairs and cover 'em." He raced on up the main stairway. As he took the treads 3 at a time, on his toes, he was trying to find a niche for one fact of remarkable interest. Unless Rosemary Chase was the greatest natural actress that a generation of talent scouts had overlooked, unless his own judgment had gone completely cockeyed, the interruption had hit her with the same chilling shock as it had given him. It was to learn that he had stayed to study her face before he moved. He was sure that he would have caught any shadow of deception. And yet if there had really been no shadow, they had to catch it meant that something had happened for which she was totally unprepared. And that, in its turn, might mean that all of his suspicions of her were without foundation. It gave a jolt to the theories he had begun to put together that threw them into new and fascinating outlines, and he reached the top of the stairs with a glint of purely speculative delight shifting behind the grim alertness of his eyes. From the head of the staircase, the landing opened off in the shape of a squat long-armed T. All the doors that he saw at first were closed. He strode lightly into the junction of the two arms and heard a faint movement down the left-hand corridor. Simon took a breath and jumped out on a quick slant that would have been highly disconcerting to any marksman who might have been waiting for him round the corner. But there was no marksman. The figures of two men were piled together on the floor in the middle of a sickening mess, and only one of them moved. The one who moved was Dr. Quintus, who was groggily trying to scramble to his feet as the saint reached him. The one who lay still was Jim Forrest, and Simon did not need to look at him twice to see that his stillness was permanent. The mess was blood. Pools and gouts and splashes of blood, in hideous quantity, puddling on the floor, dripping down the walls, soddening the striped blazer and the mottling of the doctor's clothes. The gaping slash that split Forrest's throat from ear to ear had almost decapitated him. The saint's stomach turned over once. Then he was grasping the doctor's arm and helping him up. There was so much blood on him that Simon couldn't tell what his injuries might be. "Where are you hurt?" he snapped. The other shook his head muzzily. His weight was leaden on Simon's sporting grip. "Not me," he humbled hoarsely. "All right, only hit me on the head. Forrest." "Who did it?" "Don't know. Probably same as Nora. Heard Forrest yell." "Where did he go?" Quintus seemed to be in a daze through which outside promptings only reached him in the same form as outside noises reach the brain of a sleepwalker. He seemed to be making a tremendous effort to retain some sort of consciousness, but his eyes were half closed, and his words were thick and rambling, as if he were dead drunk. "I suppose Forrest was going to his room or something. Caught murderer sneaking about. Murderer stabbed him. I heard him yell. Stabbed. Got hit with something. Be all right. Soon. Catch him." "Well, where did he go?" Simon shook him, roughly slapped up the sagging head. The doctor's chest heaved as though it were taking part in his terrific struggle to achieve coherence. He got his eyes wide open. "Don't worry about me," he whispered with painful clarity. "Look after Mr. Chase." His eyelids fluttered again. Simon let him go against the wall, and he slid down almost to a sitting position, clasping his head in his hands. The saint balanced his Luger in his hand, and his eyes were narrowed to chips of sapphire hardness. He glanced up and down the corridor. From where he stood, he could see the length of both passages which formed the arms of the T-plan of the landing. The arm on his right finished with a glimpse of the banisters of a staircase leading down, obviously the back stairs, whose existence the butler had admitted, at the foot of which Hoppy Oniats must already have taken up his post. There had been no sound of disturbance from that direction, nor had there been any sound from the front hall where he had left Rosemary Chase with the butler, and there was no other normal way out for anyone who was upstairs. The left-hand corridor where he stood ended in a blank wall, and only one door along it was open. Simon stepped past the doctor and over Forrest's body, and went silently to the open door. He came to it without any other precautions that he had taken before exposing himself a few moments before. He had the presentiment amounting to conviction that they were unnecessary now. He remembered with curious distinctness that the drawing-room curtains had not been drawn since he entered the house. Therefore, anyone who wanted to could have shot at him from outside long ago. No one had shot at him. Therefore, he was looking into a large, white-painted, airy bedroom. The big double bed was empty, but the covers were thrown open and rumpled. The table beside it was loaded with medicine bottles. He opened the doors in the two side walls. One belonged to a spacious built-in cupboard filled with clothing. The other was a bathroom. The wall outside the entrance door was broken by long casement windows, most of them wide open. He crossed over to one of them and looked out. Directly beneath him was the flat roof of a porch. The saint put his gun back in his holster and felt an unearthly, cold, dry calm sinking through him. Then he climbed out over the sill onto the porch roof below, which almost formed a kind of blind balcony under the window. He stood there recklessly, knowing that he was silhouetted against the light behind, and lit a cigarette with leisured, tremulous hands. He sent a cloud of blue vapor drifting towards the stars, and then with the same leisured passivity, he sauntered to the edge of the balustrade, sat on it, and swung his legs over. From there was an easy drop onto the parapet, which bordered the terrace along the front of the house, and an even easier drop from the top of the parapet to the ground, To an active man, the return journey would not present much more difficulty. He paused long enough to draw another lungful of night air and tobacco smoke, then strolled on along the terrace. It was an eerie experience, to know that he was an easy target every time he passed a lighted window, to remember that the killer might be watching him from a few yards away, and still to hold his steps down to the same steady pace. But the saint's nerves were hardened to an icy quietness, and all his senses were working together in taut-strung vigilance. He walked 3/4 of the way round the building and arrived at the back door. It was unlocked when he tried it, and he pushed it open and looked down the barrel of Mr. Uniatz's Betsy. "I'll bet you'll shoot somebody one of these days, Hoppy," he remarked. Mr. Uniatz lowered the gun with a faint tinge of disappointment. "What you find, boss?" "Quite a few jolly interesting things." The saint was only smiling with his lips. "Hold the fort a bit longer, I'll tell you." He found his way through the kitchen, where the other servants were clustered together in dumb, terrified silence, back to the front hall where Rosemary Chase and the butler were standing together at the foot of the stairs. They jumped as if a gun had been fired when they heard his footsteps. Then the girl ran towards him and caught him by the lapels of his coat. "What is it?" she pleaded frantically. "What happened?" "I'm sorry," he said, as gently as he could. She stared at him. He meant her to read his face, for everything except the fact that he was still watching her like a spectator on the dark side of the footlights. "Where's Jim?" He didn't answer. She caught her breath suddenly, with a kind of sob, and turned towards the stairs. He grabbed her elbows, turned her back, and held her. "I wouldn't go up," he said evenly. "It wouldn't do any good." "Tell me then, for God's sake, tell me, is he—" She choked on the word. "Dead?" "Yes." Her face was whiter than chalk, but she kept her feet. Her eyes dragged at his knowledge through a brightness of unheeded tears. "Why do you say it like that? What else is there?" "Your father seems to have disappeared," he said, and held her as she went limp in his arms. Chapter 8. Simon carried her into the drawing room and laid her down on a sofa. He stood gazing at her introspectively for a moment. Then he bent over her again quickly and stabbed her in the solar plexus with a stiff forefinger. She didn't stir a muscle. The monotonous cheep of a telephone bell ringing somewhere outside reached his ears, and he saw the butler starting to move mechanically towards the door. Simon passed him and saw the instrument half hidden by a curtain on the other side of the hall. He took the receiver off the hook and said, "Hello? May I speak to Mr. Templar, please?" The saint put a hand on the wall to save himself from falling over. "Who wants him?" "Mr. Trapani." "Julio!" Simon exclaimed. The voice was familiar now, but its complete unexpectedness had prevented him from recognizing it before. "It's been about 16 years since I saw you, and I never came back for dinner." "That's quite all right, Mr. Templar. I didn't expect you when I knew what had happened. I only called up now because it's getting late, and I didn't know if you would want a room for tonight." The saint's brows drew together. "What the hell is this?" he demanded slowly. "You taking up crystal gazing or something?" Julio Trapani chuckled. "No, I'm not any good at that. The police sergeant stopped here on his way back and he told me. Said he got mixed up with a murder and Miss Chase had taken her home with her, so of course I knew he'd be very busy. Has she asked you to stay?" "Let me call you back in a few minutes, Julio," said the saint. "Things have been happening, and I've got to hold off the police again." He paused, and a thought struck him. "Look, is Sergeant Jessler still there by any chance?" There was no answer. Simon barked, "Hello?" Silence. He jiggled the hook. The movements produced no corresponding clicks in his ear. He waited a moment longer, while he realized that the stillness of the receiver was not the stillness of a broken connection, but a complete, inanimate muteness that stood for something less easily remedied than that. He hung the receiver up and traced the course of the wiring with his eyes, ran along the edge of the wainscoting to the frame of the front door, and disappeared into a hole bored at the edge of the wood. Simon turned right round with another abrupt realization. He was alone in the hall. The butler was no longer in sight. He slipped his pencil flashlight out of its breast pocket with his left hand and let himself out the front door. The telephone wires ran up outside along the margin of the doorframe and continued up over the exterior wall. The beam of his torch followed them up past a lighted window over the porch from which he had climbed down a few minutes ago, to where they were attached to a pair of porcelain insulators under the eaves. Where the wires leading from the insulators might once have gone was difficult to decide. They dangled slackly downwards now, straddling the balcony and trailing away into the darkness of the drive. The saint switched off his light and stood motionless. Then he flitted across the terrace, crossed the drive, and merged himself into the shadow of a big clump of laurels on the edge of the lawn. Again he froze into breathless immobility. The blackness ahead of him was Stygian, impenetrable, even to his noctambulent eyes, but hearing would serve his temporary purpose almost as well as sight. The night had fallen so still that he could even hear the rustle of a distant river, and he waited for minutes that seemed like hours to him, and must have seemed like weeks to a guilty prowler who could not have travelled very far after the wires were broken. And whilst he waited, he was trying to decide at exactly what point in his last speech the break had occurred. It could easily have happened at a place where Trapani would think he'd finished and rung off. But he heard nothing while he stood there, not the snap of a twig, nor the rustle of a leaf. He went back to the drawing room and found the butler standing there, wringing his hands in a helpless sort of way. "Where have you been?" he inquired coldly. The man's loose bloodhound jowls wobbled. I went to fetch my wife, sir." He indicated the stout, red-faced woman who was kneeling beside the couch, chafing the girl's nerveless wrist, to see if she could help Miss Chase. Simon's glance flickered over the room like a rapier blade and settled pricklingly on an open French window. "Did you have to fetch her in from the garden?" he asked sympathetically. I don't understand, sir." "Don't you? Well, neither do I. But that window was closed when I saw it last." "I opened it just now, sir, to give Miss Chase some fresh air." The saint held his eyes ruthlessly, but the butler did not try to look away. "All right," he said at length. "We'll check up on that presently. Just for the moment, you can both go back to the kitchen." A stout woman got to her feet with the laboured motions of a rheumatic camel. "Who do you think you are," she demanded indignantly, "to be bossing everybody about in this house?" "I'm the Gragangunk of Waziristan," answered the saint pleasantly, "and I said get back to the kitchen." He folded them back himself and went on through to find Hoppy Uniats. The other door of the kitchen conveniently opened into the small rear hall into which the back stairs came down, and from which the back door also opened. Simon locked and bolted the back door, and drew Hoppy into the kitchen doorway and propped him up against the jamb. "If you stand here," he said, "you'll be able to cover you'll be able to cover the back stairs and this gang in the kitchen at the same time. That's what I want you to do. None of them is to move out of your sight, not even to get somebody else some fresh air." "Okay, boss," said Mr. Uniats dimly. "If I only had a drink. Tell Jeeves to buy you one." The saint was on his way out again when the butler stopped him. "Please, sir, I'm sure I could be of some use." "You are being useful," said the saint, and closed the door on him. Rosemary Chase was sitting up when he returned to the drawing room. "I'm sorry," she said weakly. "I'm afraid I fainted." "I'm afraid you did," said the saint. "I poked you in the tummy to make sure it was real, and it was. Looks as if I've been wrong about you all the evening. I've got a lot of apologies to make. You'll have to imagine most of them. Would you like a drink?" She nodded, and he turned to the table and operated with a bottle and siphon. While he was doing it, he said with matter-of-fact naturalness, "How many servants do you keep here?" The butler and his wife, a housemaid, and a parlour maid." "Then they're all rounded up and accounted for." "How long have you known them?" "Only about 3 weeks, since we've been here." "So that means nothing. I should have had them corralled before, but I didn't think fast enough." He brought the drink over and gave it to her. "Anyway, they're corralled now under Hoppy's thirsty eyes, so if anything else happens, we'll know they didn't have anything to do with it. If that's any help, which leaves only us and Quintus." "What happened to him?" "He said he got whacked on the head by our roving boogeyman." "Hadn't you better look at him?" "Sure. In a minute." Simon crossed the room and closed the open window and drew the curtains. He came back and stood by the table to light a cigarette. There had been so much essential activity during the past few minutes that he had had no time to do any constructive thinking. But now, he had to get every possible blank filled in before the next move was made. He put his lighter away and studied her with cool and friendly encouragement, as if they had a couple of years to spare in which to straighten out misunderstandings. She sipped a drink and looked up at him with dark, stricken eyes from which he knew all pretense and concealment had now been wiped away. They were eyes that he would have liked to see without the grief in them, and the pallor of her face made him remember its loveliness as he had first seen it. Her red lips formed bitter words without flinching. I'm the one who ought to have been killed. If I hadn't been such a fool, this might never have happened. I ought to be thrown in the river with a weight round my neck. Why don't you say so? That wouldn't be of any use now, he said. I'd rather you made up for it. Give me the story. She brushed the hair off her forehead with a weary gesture. The trouble is, I can't. There isn't any story that's worth telling. Just that I was trying to be clever. It all began when I read a letter that I hadn't any right to read. It was in this room. I'd been out. I came in through the French windows. I sat down at the desk because I'd just remembered something I had to make a note of. The letter was on the blotter in front of me. The letter you got. Nora must have just finished it and then left the room for a moment, just before I came in, not thinking anyone else would be around. I saw your name on it. I'd heard of you, of course. It startled me so much that I was reading on before I knew what I was doing, and then I couldn't stop. I read it all. Then I heard Nora coming back. I lost my head and slipped it out through the window again without her seeing me. And you never spoke to her about it? I couldn't. Later. After all that, I couldn't sort of come out and confess I'd read it. Oh, I know I was a damn fool, but I was scared. It seemed as if she must know something dreadful that my father was involved in. I didn't know anything about his affairs, but I loved him. If he was doing something crooked, whatever it was, I'd have been hurt to death, but I still wanted to try and protect him. I couldn't talk about it to anybody but Jim. We decided the only thing was to find out what it was all about. That's why we followed Nora to the bell and then followed you to the boathouse. Why didn't you tell me this before? She shrugged hopelessly. Because I was afraid to. Remember, I asked you about how much you hated crooks. I was afraid that if my father was mixed up in anything wrong, you'd be even more merciless than the police. I wanted to save him, but I didn't think all this would happen. It was hard enough not to say anything when we found Nora dead. Now that Jim's been killed, I can't go on with it anymore. The saint was silent for a moment, weighing her with his eyes. And then he said, What do you know about this guy Quintus? Chapter 9. Hardly anything, she said. He happened to be living close to where the accident happened, and Father was taken to his house. Father took such a fancy to him that when they brought him home, he insisted on bringing Dr. Quintus along to look after him. At least, that's what I was told. I know what you're thinking, she looked at him steadily. You think there's something funny about him. Phony is the way I pronounce it, answered the saint bluntly. She nodded. I wondered about him too, after I read that letter. But how can I say anything? Can you think of anything that might have given him a hold over your father? She moved her hands desperately. How could I know? Father never talked business at home. I never heard anything discreditable about him. But how would I know? You've seen your father since he was brought home? Of course, lots of times. Did he seem to have anything on his mind? I can't tell. Or did he seem to be worried or frightened? It's so hard, she said. I don't know what I really saw and what I'm making myself imagine. He was badly hurt, you know, and he was still trying to keep some of his business affairs going, so that took a lot out of him, and Dr. Quintus never let me stay with him very long at a time. And then he didn't feel like talking much. Of course, he seemed shaky and not a bit like himself, but after an accident like that, you wouldn't expect anything else. I don't know what to think about anything. I thought he always liked Jim, and now... Oh, God, what a mess I've made. The saint smoothed the end of his cigarette in an ashtray, and there was an odd kind of final contentment in his eyes. All the threads were in his hands now, all the questions answered, except for the one answer that would cover all the others. Being as he was, he could understand Rosemary Chase's story, forgetting the way it had ended. Others might have found it harder to forgive, but to him it was just the old tale of amateur adventuring leading to tragic disaster. And even though his own amateur adventures had never led there, it was still close enough for him to realize the hair-breadth margin by which they had escaped it, and the story she told him gathered up many loose ends. He sat down beside her and put his hand on her arm. "Don't blame yourself too much about Jim," he said sedately. "He made some of the mess himself. If he hadn't thrown me off the track by the way he behaved, things might have been a lot different." Why the hell did he have to do that? He'd made up his mind you'd only come into this for what you could get out of it. But if you found out what Nora knew, you'd use it to blackmail Father or something like that. He wasn't terribly clever. I suppose he thought you'd killed her to keep the information to yourself. The saint shrugged wryly. "And I thought one of you had killed her to keep her mouth shut. None of us has been very clever. Yet." "What are you going to do? What are we going to do?" she said. Simon thought. And he may have been about to answer when his ears caught a sound that stopped him. His fingers tightened on the girl's wrist for an instant, while his eyes rested on her like bright steel, and then he got up. "Give me another chance," he said, a soft voice that could not have even been heard across the room. And then he was walking across to greet the doctor as the footsteps that had stopped him arrived at the door, and Quintus came in. Dr. Quintus, the saint's air was sympathetic, his face full of concern. He took the doctor's arm. "You shouldn't have come down alone. I was just coming back for you, and there have been so many other things. I know, and they were probably more valuable than anything you could have done for me." The blurry resonance of the other's voice was clearly normal again. He moved firmly over to the table on which the tray of drinks stood. I'm going to prescribe myself a whiskey and soda," he said. Simon fixed it for him. Quintus took the glass and sat down gratefully on the edge of a chair. He rubbed a hand over his disheveled head as though trying to clear away the lingering remnants of fog. He had washed his face and hands, but the darkening patches of red stain on his clothing were still gruesome reminders of the man who had not come down. "I'm sorry I was so useless, Mr. Templar," he said heavily. "Did you find anything?" "Not a thing." The saint's straightforwardness sounded completely ingenuous. "Mr. Chase must have been taken out of the window. I climbed down from there myself. It was quite easy. I walked most of the way around the house. Nothing happened. I didn't hear a sound. It was too dark to see anything." Quintus looked across to the girl. "There isn't anything I can say, Miss Chase. I can only tell you that I would have given my own right hand to prevent this." "But why?" she said brokenly. "Why are all of these things happening? What is it all about? First Nora, then Jim, and now my father. What's happened to him? What have they done with him?" The doctor's lips tightened. "Kidnapped, I suppose," he said wretchedly. "I suppose everything's been leading up to that. Your father's a rich man. They'd expect him to be worth a large ransom, large enough to run any risks for. Jim's death was, well, just a tragic accident. I ran into one of them in a corridor. He was murdered. If that hadn't confused them, they'd probably have murdered me." "They?" interposed the saint quickly. "You saw them, then?" "Only one man, the one who hit me. He was rather small. He had a handkerchief tied over his face. Didn't have a chance to notice much. I say they because I don't see how one man alone could have organized and done all this. It must be kidnapping. Possibly they were trying to force a bribe in order to help them from the inside. And she was murdered because she threatened to give them away. And they tried to kill me, in case she had told me about that plot. Exactly." Simon put down the stub of his cigarette and searched for a fresh one. "How do you think they should think that she might have told me anything?" he inquired. Quintus hesitated expressionlessly. He drank slowly from his glass and brought his cavernous black eyes back to the saint's face. "With your reputation, if you'll forgive me, finding you on the scene, and they theorizing, of course." Simon nodded good-humoredly. "Don't apologize," he murmured. "My reputation is a great asset. It's made plenty of clever crooks lose their heads before this." "It must be kidnapping," Quintus repeated, turning to the girl. "If they'd wanted to harm your father, they could have easily have done it in his bedroom where they had him at their mercy. They wouldn't have needed to take him away. You must be brave and think about that. The very fact that they took him away proves they want him alive." The saint finished chain lighting the fresh cigarette and strolled over to the fireplace to flick away the butt of the old one. He stood there for a moment, and then turned thoughtfully back to the room. Talking of this taken away, he said, I did notice something screwy about it. I didn't waste much time getting upstairs after I heard the commotion, and starting from the same commotion, our kidnapping guy, or guys, had to dash into the bedroom, grab Mr. Chase, shove him out the window, lower him to the ground, all of which must have taken a certain amount of time. He looked at the doctor. Well, I wasted a certain amount of time myself in the corridor, finding out whether you were hurt and so forth, so those times began to cancel out. Then when I got in the bedroom, I saw at once that the bed was empty. I looked in the cupboard and the bathroom, just making sure the old boy really was gone, but that couldn't have taken more than a few seconds. I went straight to the window, and then almost immediately climbed out of it and climbed down to the ground to see if I could see anything. Because I knew Marvin Chase could only have gone out that way. Now, you remember what I told you? I didn't hear a sound. Not so much as a dropping of a pin. What do you mean? Asked the girl. I mean this, said the saint. Figure out our timetables for yourselves, the kidnappers and mine. They can't have been more than a few seconds ahead of me. And from below the window, they had to get your father to a car, shove him in, and take him away. If they took him away. But I told you, I walked all round the house, slowly, listening. I didn't hear anything. When did they start making these completely noiseless cars? Quintus half rose from his chair. You mean they might still be on the grounds? Then we're sure to catch them as soon as the police get here. You've sent for them, of course. Simon shook his head. Not yet. And that's something else that makes me think I'm right. I haven't called the police yet because I can't. I can't call them because the telephone wires have been cut. And they were cut after all this had happened. After I'd walked round the house and come back in and told Rosemary what happened. The girl's lips were parted, her wide eyes fastened on him with a mixture of fear and eagerness. She began to say, But they might... The crash stopped her. Her eyes switched to the left, and Simon saw a blank horror leap into her face as he whirled towards the sound. It had come from one of the windows. It sounded like smashing glass. It was the glass. He saw the stir of the curtains and the gloved hand that came between them under a shining gun barrel, and flung himself fiercely backwards. Chapter 10. He catapulted himself at the main electric light switches beside the door, without conscious decision, but knowing that his instinct must be right. More slowly, while he was moving, his mind reasoned it out. The unknown man who had broken the window had already beaten him to the draw, and in an open gun battle with the lights on. The unknown had a 3-to-1 edge in choice of targets. Then the saint's shoulder hit the wall, and his hand sliced up over the switches just as the invader's revolver spoke once, deafeningly. Blam! Simon heard the sprang of the bullet some distance from him, and more glass shattered. Quintus gasped deeply. The saint's ears sang with the concussion, but through the buzzing he was trying to determine whether the gunman had come in. He moved sideways, noiselessly, crouching, his Luger out in his hand. Nothing else seemed to move. His brain was working again in a cold fever of precision. Unless the pot-shot artist had hoped to settle everything with the first bullet, he would expect the saint to rush the window. Therefore, the saint would not rush the window. The utter silence of the room was battering his brain with warnings. His fingers touched the knob of the door, closed on it, and turned it without a rattle until the latch disengaged. Gathering his muscles, he whipped it suddenly open, leapt through it out into the hall, and slammed it behind him. In the one red-hot instant when he was clearly outlined against the lights of the hall, a second shot blasted out of the dark behind him and splintered the woodwork close to his shoulder, but his exposure was too swift and unexpected for the sniper's marksmanship. Without even looking back, Simon dived across the hall and let himself out of the front door. He raced round the side of the house and dropped to a crouch again as he reached the corner that would bring him in sight of the terrace outside the drawing-room windows. He slid an eye round the corner, prepared to yank it back on an instant's notice, and then left it there with the brow over it lowering in a frown. It was dark on the terrace, but not too dark for him to see that there was no one standing there. He scanned the darkness on his right, away from the house, but he could find nothing in it that resembled a lurking human shadow. And over the whole garden brooded the same eerie stillness, the same incredible absence of any hint of movement. It but it sent feathery fingers creeping up his spine. When he was out there before, the saint eased himself along the terrace, flat against the wall of the house, his forefinger tight on the trigger, his eyes probing the blackness of the grounds. No more shots came at him. He reached the French windows with a broken pane and stretched out a hand to test the handle. They wouldn't open. They were still fastened on the inside, as he had fastened them. He spoke close to the broken pane. "All clear, souls. Don't put the lights on yet, but let me in." Presently, the windows swung back. There were shutters outside, and he folded them across the opening and bolted them as he stepped in. Their hinges were stiff from long disuse. He did the same at the other window, where he groped his way back to the door and relit the lights. "Oh, this place looked like a fortress before we're through," he remarked cheerfully. Then the girl ran to him and caught his sleeve. "Didn't you see anyone?" He shook his head. "Not a soul." The guy didn't even open the window, just stuck his gun through the broken glass and sighted from outside. An idea he was expecting me to charge through the window after him, and then he'd have had me cold. But I fooled him. I guess he heard me coming round the house and took his feet off the ground. He smiled at her reassuringly. "Excuse me a minute while I peep at Hoppy. He might be worried." He should have known better than to succumb to that delusion. In the kitchen, a trio of white-faced women and one man who was not much more sanguine jumped round with panicky squeals and googling eyes as he entered, but Mr. Uniot's removed the bottle which he was holding to his lips with dawdling reluctance. "Aye, boss," said Mr. Uniot's, with as much phlegmatic cordiality as could be expected of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of some important business, and the saint regarded him with new respect. "Doesn't anything ever worry you, Hoppy?" he inquired mildly. Mr. Uniot's waved his bottle with liberal nonchalance. "Sure, boss. I had the fireworks," he said, "but I think if anyone's getting hot, and it's some other guy. How Tings?" "Tings will be swell, so long as I know you're on the job," said the saint reverently, and withdrew again. He went back to the drawing-room with his hands in his pockets, not hurrying, and in spite of what had happened he felt more composed than he had been all the evening. It was as if he sensed that the crescendo was coming to a climax beyond which it could go no further. While all the time his own unravelings were simplifying the tangled undercurrents towards one final resolving chord that would bind them all together. And the two must coincide and blend. All he wanted was a few more minutes, a few more answers. His smile was almost indecently carefree when he faced the girl again. "All is well," he reported. "I'm afraid Hoppy is ruining your cellar." She came up to him, her eyes searching him anxiously. "That shot when you ran out," she said. "You aren't hurt?" "Not a bit, but it's depressing to feel so unpopular." "Well, what makes you think you're the only one who's unpopular?" asked the doctor dryly. He was still sitting in the chair where Simon had left him, and Simon followed his glance as he screwed his neck round indicatively. Just over his left shoulder, a picture on the wall had a dark-edged hole drilled in it, and a few scraps of glass that still clung to the frame formed a jagged circle round it. The saint gazed at the bullet scar, and for a number of seconds he said nothing. He had heard the impact, of course, and heard the tinkle of glass, but since the shot had missed him, he hadn't given it another thought. Now that its direction was pointed out to him, the whole sequence of riddles seemed to fall into focus. The chain of alibis was complete. Anyone might have murdered Nora Prescott, even Rosemary Chase and Forrest. Rosemary Chase herself could have fired the shot at the boathouse an instant before Forrest switched on his torch and then rejoined him. But Forrest wasn't likely to have cut his own throat, and even if he had done that, he couldn't have abducted Marvin Chase afterwards. And when Forrest was killed, the saint himself was Rosemary Chase's alibi. The butler might have done all of these things, but after that, he had been shut in the kitchen with Hoppy Uniats to watch over him, so that the saint's own precaution acquitted him of having fired those last two shots a few minutes ago. Dr. Quintus might have done everything else. He might never have been hit on the head upstairs at all, but he certainly couldn't have fired those two shots either. And one of them had actually been aimed at him. Simon went back to his original position by the fireplace to make sure of it. The result did not permit the faintest shadow of doubt. even allowing for his dash to the doorway. If the first shot had been aimed at the saint and had just missed Quintus instead, it must have been fired by someone who could not get within 10 feet of the bullseye at 10 yards range. An explanation that wasn't even worth considering. And that left only one person who had never had an alibi, who had never been asked for one because he had never seemed to need one. The man around whom all the commotion was centered. And yet, the one member of the cast, so far as the saint was concerned, who had never yet appeared on the scene. Someone who, for all obvious purposes, might have just as well have been non-existent. But if Marvin Chase himself had done all the wild things that had been done that night, it would mean that the story of his injuries must be entirely fictitious. It was hardly plausible that any man would fabricate and elaborate such a story at a time when there was no conceivable advantage to be gained from it. Simon thought about that, and everything in him seemed to be standing still. The girl was saying, "These people wouldn't be doing this if they just wanted to kidnap my father, unless they were maniacs. They can't get any ransom if they kill off everyone who's ever had anything to do with him. That's what they seem to be trying to do." "Except you," said the saint almost inattentively. "You haven't been hurt yet." He was thinking, the accident happened a week ago, days before Nora Prescott wrote to me, before there was ever any reason to expect me on the scene. But all these things that a criminal might want an alibi for have happened since I came into the picture, and probably on my account. Marvin Chase might have been a swindler, and he might have rubbed out his secretary in a phony motor accident because he knew too much, but for all he could have known, that would have been the end of it. He didn't need to pretend to be injured himself and take the extra risk of bringing in a phony doctor to build up the atmosphere. Therefore, he didn't invent his injuries. Therefore, his alibi is as good as anyone else's. Therefore, we are right back where we started. Or did it mean that he was at the very end of the hunt? In a kind of trance, he walked over to the broken window and examined the edges of the smashed pane. On the point of one of the jags of glass clung a couple of kinky white threads, such as might have been ripped out of a gauze bandage. Coming into the train of thought that his mind was following, the realization of what they meant gave him hardly any sense of shock. He already knew that he was never going to meet Marvin Chase. Dr. Quintus was getting to his feet. "I'm feeling better now," he said. "I'll go for the police." "Just a minute," said the saint quietly. "I think I can have somebody ready for them to arrest when they get here." Chapter 11. He turned to the girl and took her shoulders in his hands. "I'm sorry, Rosemary," he said. "You're going to be hurt now." Then, without stopping to face the bewildered fear that came into her eyes, he went to the door and raised his voice. "Send the butler along, Hoppy. See that the curtains are drawn where you are, and keep an eye on the windows. If anyone tries to rush you from any direction, give them the heat first and ask questions afterwards." "Okay, boss," replied Mr. Onias obediently. The butler came down the hall as if he were walking on eggs. His impressively fleshy face was pallid and apprehensive, but he stood before the saint with a certain ineradicable dignity. "Yes, sir." Simon beckoned him to the front door, and this time the saint was very careful. He turned out all the hall lights before he opened the door, and then drew the butler quietly outside without fully closing it behind them. They stood. The shadow of the porch covered them in solid blackness. "Jeeves," he said, and in contrast with all that circumspection, his voice was extraordinarily clear and carrying. "I want you to go to the nearest house and use their phone to call the police station. Ask for Sergeant Jesser. I want you to give him a special message." "Me, sir?" Simon couldn't see the other's face, but he could imagine the expression on it from the tremulous tone of the reply. He smiled to himself, but his eyes were busy in the dark void of the garden. "Yes, you. Are you scared?" "No, sir, but—" "Then I know what you mean. It's creepy, isn't it? I'd feel the same way myself, but don't let it get you down. Have you ever handled a gun?" "I had a little experience during the war, sir." "Swell. Then here's a present for you." Simon felt for the butler's flabby hand and pressed his own Luger into it. "It's all loaded, ready to talk. If anything tries to happen, use it. And this is something else. I'll be with you. You won't hear me. You won't see me. I'll be close by. If anyone tries to stop you or do anything to you, we get a nasty surprise. So don't worry. You're going to get through." He could hear the butler swallow. Very good, sir. What was the message you wished me to take?" "It's for Sergeant Jess, sir," Simon repeated, with the same careful clarity. "Tell him about the murder of Mr. Forrest, and the other things that have happened. Tell him I sent you, and tell him I've solved the mystery, so he needn't bother bringing back his gang of coroners and photographers and fingerprint experts and whatnot. Tell him I'm getting a confession now, and I'll have it all written out and signed for him by the time he gets here. Can you remember that?" "Yes, sir." "Okay, Jeeves, on your way." He slipped his other automatic out of his hip pocket and stood there while the butler crossed the drive and melted into the inky shadows beyond. He could hear the man's softened footsteps even when he was out of sight, but they kept regularly on until they faded in the distance, and there was no disturbance. When he felt as sure as he could hope to be that the butler was beyond the danger zone, he put the walther away again and stepped soundlessly back into the darkened hall. Rosemary Chase and the doctor stared blankly at him as he re-entered the drawing room, and he smiled blandly at their mystification. "I know," he said. "You heard me tell Jeeves was going to follow him." Quintus said, "But why?" "For the benefit of the guy outside," answered the Saint calmly. "If there is a guy outside. The guy who's been giving us so much trouble. If he's hung around as long as this, he's still around. He hasn't finished his job yet. He missed the balloon pretty badly on the last try, and he daren't pull out and leave it missed. He's staying right on the spot, wondering like hell what kind of fast play he can work in to save his bacon. So he heard what I told the butler. I meant him to. And I think it worked. I scared him away from trying to head off Jeeves with another carving knife performance. Instead of that, he decided to stay here and try to clean up before the police arrive. That's also what I meant him to do." The doctor's deep-set eyes blinked slowly. "Then the message you sent was only another bluff?" "Well, partly. I may have exaggerated a little. But I meant to tickle our friend's curiosity. I wanted to make sure that he'd be frantic to find out more about it, so he had to know what was going on in this room. I'll bet money he's listening to every word I'm saying now." The girl glanced at the broken window, beyond which the Venetian shutters hid them from outside, but would not silence their voices, and then glanced at the door, and she shivered. She said, "But then he knows you didn't go with the butler." "But he knows it's too late to catch him up. Besides, this is much more interesting now. He wants to find out how much I've really got up my sleeve, and I want to tell him." "But you said you were only bluffing," she protested huskily. "You don't really know anything." The Saint shook his head. "I only said I was exaggerating a little. I haven't got a confession yet, but I'm hoping to get one. The rest of it is true. I know everything that's behind tonight's fun and games. I know why everything's been done, and who did it." They did not try to prompt him, but their wide-open eyes clung to him almost as if they had been hypnotized. It was as if an unreasoned fear of what he might be going to say made them shrink from pressing him. At the same time, they were spellbound by a fascination beyond their power to break. The Saint made the most of his moment. He made them wait while he sauntered to a chair and settled himself there and lit a cigarette, as if they were only enjoying an ordinary casual conversation. The theatrical pause was deliberate, aimed at the nerves of the one person whom he had to drive into self-betrayal. "It's all so easy, really, when you sort it out," he said at length. "Our criminal's a clever chap, and he'd figured out a swindle that was so simple and audacious that it was practically foolproof, barring accidents. And to make up for the thousandth fraction of risk, it was bound to put millions into his hands. Only the accident happened, and one accident led to another." He took smoke from his cigarette and returned it through musingly half-smiling lips. "The accident was when Nora Prescott wrote to me. She had to be in on the swindle, of course, but he thought he could keep her quiet with a threat that if she exposed him, her father would lose the sinecure that was practically keeping him alive. It wasn't a very good threat, and if she'd been a little more sensible. But it scared her enough to keep her away from the police. It didn't scare her out of thinking that a guy like me might be able to wreck the scheme somehow and still have to save something out of it for her. So she wrote to me. Our villain found out about that, but wasn't able to stop the letter. So he followed her to the Bell tonight, planning to kill me as well, because he figured once I'd received that letter, I'd keep on prying until I found something. When Nora led off to the boathouse, it looked to be in the bag. He followed her, killed her, and waited to add me to the collection. Only on account of another accident that happened then, he lost his nerve and quit. Again, the saint paused. Still, our villain knew he had to hang on to me until I could be disposed of. He went on with the same leisured confidence. He arranged to bring me up here to be got rid of as soon as he knew how. He stalled along until after dinner when he'd got a plan worked out. He'd just finished talking it over with his accomplice. Accomplice? Repeated the doctor. Yes, said the saint flatly. And just to make sure we understand each other, I'm referring to the phony medico who goes under the name of Quintus. The doctor's face went white, and his hands whitened on the arms of his chair. But the saint did not stir. I wouldn't try it, he said. I wouldn't try anything, brother, if I were you. Because if you do, I shall smash you into soup meat. Rosemary Chase stared from one to the other. You don't mean... I mean that motor accident of your father's was a lie from beginning to end. Simon's voice was gentle. He needed a phony doctor to back up the story of those injuries. He couldn't have kept it up with an honest one, and that would have wrecked everything. It took me a long time to see it, but that's because we're all ready to take too much for granted. You told me you'd seen your father since it happened, so I didn't ask any more questions. Naturally, you didn't feel like you had to tell me that when you saw him, he was smothered in bandages like a mummy, and his voice was only a hoarse croak, but he needed Quintus to keep him that way. You must be out of your mind, Quintus roared hollowly. The saint smiled. No, but you're out of a job. And it was an easy one. I said we all take too much for granted. You're introduced as a doctor, and so everyone believes it. Now you're going to have another easy job, signing the confession I promised Sergeant Jesser. You'll do it to save your own skin. You'll tell how Forrest wasn't quite such a fool as he seemed. How he listened outside Marvin Chase's room and heard you and your pal cooking up some scheme to have your pal bust this window here and take a shot at you, just for effect, then kill me and Hoppy when we came dashing into the fight. How Forrest got caught here, and how he was murdered so he couldn't spill the beans. And what else? Said a new voice. Simon turned his eyes towards the doorway, and the man who stood there, a man incongruously clad in dark wine-colored silk pajamas and bedroom slippers, whose head was swathed in bandages so that only his eyes were visible, whose gloved right hand held a revolver aimed at the saint's chest. The saint heard Rosemary come to her feet with a stifled cry and answered to her rather than to anyone else. I told you were going to be hurt, Rosemary, he said. Your father was killed a week ago. But you'll remember his secretary. This is Mr. Bertrand Tamblin. Chapter 12. You're clever, aren't you? Tamblin said viciously. Not very, said the saint regretfully. I ought to have tumbled to it long ago, but as I was saying, we all take too much for granted. Everyone spoke of you as Marvin Chase, and so I assumed that was who you were. Got thrown off the scent a bit further when Rosemary and Forrest crashed into the boathouse in an awkward moment when you got up the wind and scrammed. I didn't get anywhere near the mark until I began to think of you as an invisible millionaire. The guy that all the fuss was about and yet who couldn't be seen. Then it all straightened out. You killed Marvin Chase, burnt his body in a fake auto crash, and had yourself brought home by Quintus in his place. Nobody argued about it. You had Quintus to keep you covered. You knew enough about his affairs to keep your end up in any conversation. You could even fool his daughter on short interviews, with your face bandaged and talking in the sort of faint, unrecognizable voice that a man who'd been badly injured might talk in. And you were all set to get your hands on as much of Marvin Chase's dough as you could squeeze out of banks and bonds before anyone got suspicious. Hello. Oh, welcome in, Bun. No, you're not late. You're not late. We're just getting to the good part. Oh, that's cute, Celeste. I love the blankie emojis. Glad you're getting comfy. Yes? Oh, yes. It was a grand idea until the accidents began to happen. Forrest was another accident. You got some of his blood on you. It's on you now. and you were afraid to jump back into bed when you heard me coming up the stairs. You lost your head again and plunged into a phony kidnapping. I don't believe you skipped out of your window at all just then. You simply hopped into another room and hid there till the coast was clear. I wondered about that when I didn't hear any car driving off, and nobody took a shot at me when I walked around the house. Go on. Spending time with family. Oh, that's all right, Bun. That's all right. Just glad to have you here. Then you realized that someone would send for the police, and you had to delay that until you'd carried out your original plan of strengthening Quintus's alibi and killing Hoppy and me. You cut the phone wires. That was another error. An outside gang would have done that first and taken no chances, not run the risk of hanging around to do it after the job was pulled. Again, you didn't shoot at me when I went out the doors the second time, because you wanted to make it look as if Quintus was also being shot at first. Then, when you chose your moment, I was lucky enough to be too fast for you. When you heard me chasing round the outside of the house, you pushed off into the night for another think. I'd have had a hell of a time catching you out there in the dark, so I let you hear me talking to the butler because I knew it would fetch you in. Tamblyn nodded. You only made 2 mistakes, he said. Charteris would have been killed anyway. Only I should have chosen a better time for it. I heard Rosemary talking to him one night outside the front door, directly under my window when he was leaving. That's how I found out that Nora had written to you and where she was going to meet you. And the other mistake? Simon said coolly. That was when you let your own cleverness run away with you. When you arranged your clever scheme to get me to walk in here to provide the climax for your dramatic revelations. I even left the front door ajar to make it easy for me. You conceited fool. You've got your confession. But did you think I'd let it do you any good? Your bluff only bothered me for a moment when I was afraid Quintus had ratted. As soon as I found he hadn't, I was laughing at you. The only difference you've made is that now I shall have to kill Rosemary as well. Quintus had ideas about her. I could have used her to build up the story. Bertrand, said the Saint gravely, I'm afraid you're beginning to dribble. The revolver that was trained on him did not waver. Tell me why, Tamblyn said interestedly. Simon trickled smoke languidly through his nostrils. He was still leaning back in his chair, imperturbably relaxed, in the attitude in which he had stayed even when Tamblyn entered the room. Because it's your turn to be taken too much for granted. You thought my cleverness had run away with me, and so you stopped thinking. It doesn't seem to have occurred to you, but since I expected you to come in, I may have expected just how sociable your ideas would be when you got here. You heard me give Jeeves a gun, and so you've jumped to the conclusion that I'm unarmed. Now, will you take a look at my left hand? You notice that it's in my coat pocket. I've got you covered with another gun, Bertrand. And I'm ready to bet I can shoot faster than you. If you don't believe me, just start squeezing that trigger. Tamblyn stood gazing motionlessly at him for a moment, and then his head tilted back and a cackle of hideous laughter came through the slit in the bandages over his mouth. Oh no, Mr. Templar, he crowed. You're the one who took too much for granted. You decided that Quintus was a phony doctor, and so you didn't stop to think that he might be a genuine pickpocket. When he was holding on to you in the corridor upstairs, you remember? You took the magazines out of both your guns. You've got one shot in the chamber of the gun you've got left, and Quintus has got you covered as well now. You can't get both of us with one bullet. You've been too clever for the last time. There was no bluff. Simon knew it with a gambler's instinct, and knew that Tamblyn had the last laugh. Take your hand out of your pocket, Tamblyn snarled. Quintus is going to aim at Rosemary. If you use that gun, you're killing her as surely as if. The Saint saw Tamblyn's forefinger twitch on the trigger and waited for the sharp bite of death. The crisp thunder of cordite splintered the unearthly stillness. But the Saint felt no shock, no pain. Staring incredulously, he saw Tamblyn stagger as if a battering ram had hit him in the back. Saw him sway weakly, his right arm drooping until the revolver slipped through his fingers. Saw his knees fold and his body pivot slantingly over them like a falling tree. And saw the cubist figure and the pithecanthropid visage of Hoppy Unyats coming through the door with smoking Betsy in his hairy hand. He heard another thud on his right and looked round. The thud was caused by Quintus's gun hitting the carpet. Quintus's hands waved wildly in the air as Hoppy turned toward him. Don't shoot, he screamed. I'll give you a confession. I haven't killed anyone. Tamblin did it all. Don't shoot me. He doesn't want to be shot, Hoppy, said the saint. I think we'll let the police have him, just for a change. It may help to convince them of our virtue. Boss, said Mr. Onions, lowering his gun. I've done it. The saint nodded. He got up out of his chair. It felt rather strange to be alive and untouched. I know, he said. Another half a second, he'd been the most famous gunman on earth. Mr. Onions glanced cloudily at the body on the floor. Oh, him, he said vaguely. Yeah, but listen, boss, I've done it. You don't have to worry about it, said the saint. You've done it before, and Comrade Quintus's squeal will let you out. Rosemary Chase was coming towards him, pale but steady. It seemed to Simon Templar that a long time had been wasted in which he had been too busy to remember how beautiful she was and how warm and red her lips were. She put out a hand to him, and because he was still the saint, and always would be, his arm went round her. I know it's tough, he said, but we can't change it. It doesn't seem so bad now, somehow, she said. To know that at least my father wasn't doing all of this. I wish I knew how to thank you. Hoppy's the guy to thank, said the saint, and looked at him. I never suspected you of being a thought reader, Hoppy, but I give it a lot to know. I give a lot to know what made you come out of the kitchen in the nick of time. Mr. Onions blinked him. That's what I mean, boss, when I say I done it, he explained. His brow furrowed with the effort of amplifying a statement, which seemed to him to be already obvious enough. You call that the butler, he's just opening another bottle of scotch. And this time, I make the grade. I drink it down to the last drop without stopping. So I come right out to tell you. A broad beam of ineffable pride opened up a gold mine in the center of Mr. Onions' face. I done it, boss. Ain't that something? The end of The Invisible Millionaire. That one got rather good, especially towards as we got closer to the end. A lot of action in that one. Make sure I hydrate. A lot of reading here. It was really good. Yeah, it was. And it does remind me, I've actually seen this episode before of The Saint, the television version. And from what I recall, it does tend to play rather close to what we've just read here. So that's good. That's really good. Let's see here. Shall we get started on another one? I've got one here called The Affair of Hogsbotham. Let's see, we can get through the introduction, maybe a few... Yeah, let's give it a little more time here. The Affair of Hogsbotham by Leslie Charteris. Introduction. Originality in a writer is generally supposed to be an asset, although on the other side of the argument there's always the old proverb about how there's nothing new under the sun. In my very limited field, I've tried to achieve a little originality. I don't know with how much success. Within the rather conventionalized boundaries of the modern crime story, there are actually only a very small, definite number of choices for the central figure, who must be what you might call the focal point of the lens through which the reader is going to inspect the crime. He or she can be A, an observant bystander, B, a professional policeman, C, a brilliant amateur, D, a sort of saint, or E, the criminal. These possibilities are even more reduced in practice. The observant bystander is necessarily negative, and to me, an unsatisfactory evasion. The professional policeman, if credibly depicted, would have to be a little dull and stereotyped. For what seems to me to be the obvious reason that no one with an original personality would want to be a professional policeman, or if he did want to be one, that no police force under the present system would encourage his ambition. The criminal, on the other hand, while his point of view might provide an interesting angle for a single story, cannot survive a series simply because the repetition of his crimes would make him an increasingly objectionable person. Raffles and Arsène Lupin got away with it in a very different age and are pardoned now through a kind of sentimental purifying, much as we find it convenient to forget that Richard the Lionheart probably did not take many baths. This brings us down to two alternatives, to which the brilliant amateur is the most commonly chosen. Perhaps for this reason, the effort of making him an original seems to get a little more short-winded with every incarnation. He's invested with weirder and weirder attributes in a frantic attempt to distinguish him from his continually multiplying host of predecessors. He progresses from violins and cocaine to Gallic gestures and labored malapropisms, to collections of Chinese porcelain and Egyptian scarabs, to talking like a combination menu and wine list, to quoting Oriental proverbs, to almost anything within the scope of imagination that will distinguish him as if he carried a flag. Without wanting to disparage the excellent stories that have been written by a goodly number of my contemporaries, I still feel sufficiently patriarchal in this business to admit that I sometimes visualize the agony of a new writer sitting down to the task of creating an original hero. Shall he have a glass eye and a forked red beard, and indulge the eccentricity of playing the cornet on the roof of a taxi whilst brooding over his clues? Or shall she be an overweight spinster with a passion for astrology, who can only solve her problems when she's knitting green stockings in a cemetery and being massaged by a one-armed Hindu who quotes Wordsworth with an Icelandic accent? It's getting so difficult to think of anything that hasn't been done before. But these things, of course, are only mannerisms. They do not make a man. They are characteristics, not character. That should be a platitude, but I'm afraid it is forgotten too often. I've done my best to remember it. As I said at the beginning, I've been trying to make a picture of a man. Changing, yes. Developing, I hope. Fantastic, improbable, perhaps. Quite worthless, quite irritating if you feel that way, or slightly cockeyed ideal if you feel differently. Doesn't matter so much so long as you feel that you would recognize him if you met him tomorrow. And this is the last story in this book. Originality in a story is something else again. I'm not sure whether there are 3 million plots, or fundamentally only 3. There are different schools of thought on that subject. I do know that after writing more than 80 separate stories about the same character, I've left myself wide open to be accused of falling into a formula. The selection of a concluding story was therefore quite a problem. It was a temptation to try to bow out with a parting burst of brilliance, a farewell display of fireworks, but on the other hand, I wanted a story that in its own way would summarize them all. So it should have Patricia, and Teal, and Hoppy, and Oris, and Peter Quinton, and Boodle. It should have spices of mayhem and mystery and murder, also of romance, of Teal baiting, and of the saint's own outrageous brand of philosophical indignation. All of those are here. So you might say, it just looks like a distillation of all the saint's stories. The mixture as before. You may be right too, I wouldn't know, but you'll get no apologies from me, because I'm afraid I still like it. Leslie Charteris, 1939. Chapter 1. There are times, remarked Simon Templar, putting down the evening paper and pouring himself a second glass of Tio Pepe, when I am on the verge of swearing a great oath to never look at another newspaper as long as I live. Here you have a fascinating world full of all kinds of busy people, being born, falling in love, marrying, dying, being killed, working, starving, fighting, splitting atoms and measuring stars, inventing trick corkscrews and relativity theories, building skyscrapers and suffering hell with toothache. When I buy a newspaper, I want to read all about them. I want to know what they're doing and creating and planning and striving for and going to war about. All the exciting, vital things that make a picture of a real world in real people's lives. What do I get? What do you get, Saint? Asked Patricia Home with a smile. Simon picked up the newspaper again. This is what I get, he said. I get a guy whose name, believe it or not, is Ebenezer Hogsbottom. Comrade Hogsbottom, having been born with a name like that and a face to match it, if you can believe a newspaper picture, has never had a chance in his life to misbehave, and has therefore naturally developed into one of those guys who feel that they have a mission to protect everyone else from misbehavior. He has therefore been earnestly studying the subject in order to be able to tell other people how to protect themselves from it. For several weeks, apparently, he has been frequenting the bawdiest theaters and the nudist nightclubs, discovering just how much depravity is being put out to ensnare those people who are not so shiningly immune to contamination as himself, as a result of which he's come out hot and strong for a vigorous censorship of all public entertainment. Since Comrade Hogsbottom has carefully promoted himself to be president of the National Society for the Preservation of Public Morals, He hits the front page headlines while 500 human beings who get themselves blown to bits by honorable Japanese bombs are only worth a 3-line filler on page 11. And this is the immortal utterance that he hits them with. The public has the right to be protected, he says, from displays of suggestiveness and undress which are disgusting to all right-thinking people. Right-thinking people, of course, only means people who think like Comrade Hogsbottom. But it's one of those crushing, high-sounding phrases that the Hogsbottoms of this world will seem to have a monopoly on. Excuse me while I vomit. Patricia fingered the curls in her soft golden hair and considered him guardingly. You can't do anything else about it, she said. Even you can't alter that sort of thing, so you might as well save your energy. I suppose so, the saint scowled. But it's just too hopeless to resign yourself to spending the rest of your life watching 9/10 of the world's population, who've got more than enough serious things to worry about already, being browbeaten into a superstitious respect for the humbug of a handful of yapping crypt orchid hogsbottoms. I feel that somebody on the other side of the fence ought to climb over and pin his ears back. I have a pain in the neck. I should like to do something to demonstrate my unparalleled immorality. I want to go out and burgle a convent or borrow a guitar and parade in front of Hogsbottom's house, singing obscene songs in a beery voice. Was this written recently? Lol. No, this appears to have been written back in the late 1930s. He took his glass over to the window and stood there looking down over Piccadilly and the Green Park with a faraway dreaminess in his blue eyes that seemed to be playing with all kinds of electric and reprehensible ideas beyond the humdrum view on which they were actually focused. And Patricia Home watched him with the eyes of the same reckless blue but backed by a sober understanding. She had known him too long to dismiss such a mood as lightly as any other woman would have dismissed it. Any other man might have voiced the same grumble without danger of anyone else remembering it beyond the next drink. But when the man who was so fantastically called the saint uttered that kind of unsaintly thought, his undercurrent of seriousness was apt to be translated into a different sort of headline with a frequency that Patricia needed all her reserves of mental stability to cope with. Some of the saint's wildest adventures had started from less sinister openings than that, and she measured him now with the premonition that she had not yet heard the last of that random threat. For a whole month he had done nothing illegal, and in his life 30 days of untarnished virtue was a long time. She studied the buccaneering lines of his lean figure, sensed the precariously curved restlessness under his lounging ease, and knew that even if no exterior adventure crossed his path, that month of peace would come to a spontaneous disruption. And then he turned back with a smile that did nothing to reassure her. Well, we shall see, he murmured, and glanced at his watch. Oh, it's time you're on your way to meet that moribund aunt of yours. You make sure she hasn't changed her will, because we might yet stir up some excitement by bumping her off. She made a face at him and stood up. What are you going to do tonight? I called Claude Eustace this morning and made a date to take him out to dinner. Maybe he'll know about something exciting that's going on. And it's time we were on our way, too. Are you ready, Hoppy? The rudimentary assortment of features which constituted the hairless or front elevation of Hoppy Unitz's head emerged lingeringly from behind the bottle of Caledonian Dew, with which he had been making another of his indomitable attempts to assuage the chronic aridity of his gullet. Sure, boss, he said agreeably, and always ready. Where do we meet this dame we got to bump off? The saint sighed. You'll find out. Let's go. Mr. Unietz trotted placidly after him. In Mr. Unietz's mind, a delicate organ, which he had to be careful not to overwork, there was room for none of the manifestations of philosophical indignation with which Simon Templar was sometimes troubled. By the time it had found space for the ever-present problems of quenching an insatiable thirst and finding a sufficient supply of lawfully bumpable targets to keep the rust from forming in the barrel of his Betsy, it really had room for only one other idea. And that other permanently comforting, omnipresent notion was composed entirely of the faith and devotion with which he clung to the intellectual preeminence of the saint. The saint, Mr. Unietz, had long since realized, with almost religious awe, could think. To Mr. Unietz, a man whose rare experiments with thought had always given him a dull pain under the hat, this discovery had simplified life to the point where paradise itself would have had few advantages to offer, except possibly rivers flowing with Scotch whiskey. He simply did what he was told, and everything came out all right. Anything the saint said was okay with him. 'Twas a lamentable fact that Chief Inspector Claude Eustace Teal had no such faith to buoy him up. Mr. Teal's views were almost diametrically the reverse of those which gave so much consolation to Mistonians. To Mr. Teal, the saint was a perennial harbinger of woe, an everlasting time bomb planted under his official chair. The only difference that when ordinary bombs blew up, they were at least over and done with. Whereas the saint was a bomb with its supernatural and unfair ability to blow up whenever it damn well wanted to, without in any way impairing its capacity for future explosions. He had accepted the saint's invitation to dinner with an uneasy and actually unjustified suspicion that there was probably a catch in it, as there had been in most of his previous encounters with the saint. And there was a gleam of something like smugness in his sleepy eyes as he settled more firmly behind his desk at Scotland Yard and shook his head with every conventional symptom of regret. "I'm sorry, Saint," he said. "I ought to have phoned you, but I've been so busy. I'm going to have to ask you to fix another evening. Got a bank hold-up at Staines today. I've got to go down there and take over." Simon's brows began to rise by an infinitesimal hopeful fraction. "A bank hold-up, Claude? How much did they get away with?" "About £15,000, Teal said grudgingly. "You ought to know. It was in the evening papers." "Oh, yes, I do seem to remember seeing something about it tucked away somewhere," Simon said thoughtfully. "What do you know?" The detective's mouth closed and tightened up. It was as if he was already regretting having said so much, even though the information was broadcast on the streets for anyone with a spare penny to read. But he had seen that tentatively optimistic flicker of the saint's mocking eyes too often in the past to ever be able to see it again without a queasy, hollow feeling in the pit of his ample stomach. He reacted to it with a brusqueness that sprang from a long train of memories of other occasions when crime had been in the news and boodle in the wind, and Simon Templar had greeted both promises with the same incorrigibly hopeful glimmer of mischief in his eyes, and that warning had presaged one more nightmare chapter in the apparently endless sequence that had made the name of the saint the most dreaded word in the vocabulary of the underworld, and the source of more grey hairs in Chief Inspector Teal's dwindling crop than any one man had a right to inflict on a conscientious officer of the law. "If I knew all about it, I shouldn't have to go to Staines," he said conclusively. "I'm sorry, but I can't tell you where to go and pick up the money." "Well, maybe I could run you down," Simon began temptingly. "Hoppy and I are all on our own this evening, and we were just looking for something useful to do. My car's outside and needs some exercise. Besides, I feel clever tonight. All my genius for sleuthing and deduction." "I'm sorry," Teal repeated. "There's a police car waiting for me already. I have to get along as well as I can without you." He stood up and held out his hand. A sensitive man might almost have thought he was in a hurry to avoid an argument. "Give me a ring one day next week, will you? I'll be able to tell you all about it then." Simon Templar stood on the embankment outside Scotland Yard and lit a cigarette with elaborately elegant restraint. "And that, Hoppy," he explained, "is what is technically known as the Bum's Rush." He gazed resentfully at the dingy panorama, which is the sum total of everything that generations of London architects and county councils have been able to make out of their river frontages. "Nobody loves us," he said gloomily. "Patricia forsakes us to be a dutiful niece to a palsied aunt, thereby leaving us exposed to every kind of temptation. Try to surround ourselves with holiness by dining with a detective, and he's too busy to keep the date. We offer to help him and array ourselves on the side of law and order, and he gives us the tax collector's welcome. His evil mind distrusts our immaculate motives. He's so full of suspicion and uncharitableness that he thinks our only idea is to catch up with his bank holder-uppers before he does and relieve them of their loot for our own benefit. Till he throws us out on our ear, abandons us to any wicked schemes we can cook up. What are we going to do about it?" "I don't know, boss." Mr. O'Neill shifted from one foot to the other, grimacing with the heroic effort of trying to extract a constructive suggestion from the gummy exterior of his skull. He hit upon one at last, with the trepidant amazement of another Newton grasping the law of gravity. "Maybe we could go someplace and get a drink," he suggested breathlessly. Simon grinned at him and took him by the arm. "For once in your life," he said, "I believe you've had an inspiration. Let us go to a pub and drown our sorrows." On the way, he bought another evening paper and turned wistfully to the story of the bank hold-up, but it gave him very little more than Teal had told him. The bank was a branch of the City and Continental, which handled the accounts of two important factories on the outskirts of town. That morning, the routine consignment of cash and silver and small notes had been brought down from London in a guarded van to meet the weekly payrolls of the two plants. After it had been placed in the strong room, the van and the guards had departed as usual, although the factory messengers would not call for it until the afternoon. There was no particular secrecy about the arrangements, and the possibility of a hold-up of the bank itself had apparently never been taken seriously. During lunch hour, the local police, acting on an anonymous telephone call, had sent a hurried squad to the bank in time to interrupt the hold-up, but the bandits had shot their way out, wounding 2 constables in the process, and approximately £15,000 worth of untraceable small change had vanished with them. Their car had been found abandoned only a few blocks from the bank premises, and there the trail had ended. And the Saint knew it was likely to stay ended there for all the clues contained in the printed story. England was a small country, but it contained plenty of room for 2 unidentified bank robbers to hide in. Simon refolded the newspaper and dumped it resignedly on the bar. And as he did so, it lay in such a way that the headlines summarizing the epochal utterance of Mr. Ebenezer Hogsbottom stared up at him with a complacent prominence that added insult to injury. The Saint stared malevolently back at them, and in the mood which circumstances had helped to thrust upon him their effect, had an almost fateful inevitability. No other man on earth would have taken them in just that way, but there had never been another man in history so harebrained as the Saint could be when his rebellious instincts boiled over. The idea that was being born to him grew momentarily in depth and richness. He put down his glass and went to the telephone booth to consult the directory. The action was rather like the mental tossing of a coin, and it came down heads. Mr. Hogsbottom was on the telephone, and accordingly, decisively, his address was in the book. The fact seemed to leave no further excuse for hesitation. Simon went back to the bar, and his head sang carols with the blitheness of his own insanity. "Put that poison away, Hoppy," he said. "We're going places." Mr. Onions gulped obediently and looked up with a contented beam. "Do you think of something to do, boss?" he asked eagerly. The Saint nodded. His smile was extravagantly radiant. "I did. We're going to burgle the house of Hogsbottom." Oh, this is going to be good. Chapter 2. It was one of those lunatic ideas that any inmate of an asylum might have conceived, but only Simon Templar could be relied on to carry solemnly into execution. He didn't waste any more time on pondering over it, or even stop to consider any of its legal aspects. He drove his huge cream and red Hirondo snarling over the roads to Chertsey at an average speed that was a crime in itself, and which would probably have given a nervous breakdown to any passenger less impregnably phlegmatic than Mr. Unietz. But he brought it intact to the end of the trip without any elaborations on his original idea, or any attempt to produce them. He was simply on his way to effect an unlawful entry into the domicile of Mr. Hogsbottom, and there to do something or other that would annoy Mr. Hogsbottom greatly, and at the same time relieve his own mood of general annoyance. But that meant something would be rested entirely with the inspiration of the moment. The only thing he was sure about was that the inspiration would be forthcoming. The telephone directory had told him that Mr. Hogsbottom lived in Chertsey. It also located Mr. Hogsbottom's home on Greenleaf Road, which Simon found to be a narrow turning off to Chertsey Lane, running towards the river on the far side of town. He drove the Hirondelle into a field a few hundred yards beyond the turning and left it under the broad shadow of a clump of elms, and returned to Greenleaf Road on foot. And there the telephone directory's information became vague, following the ancient custom by which the Englishman strives to preserve the sanctity of his castle from strange visitors by refusing to give it a street number, hiding it instead under a name like Monrepos, Seaview, The Birches, Dunroving, Jesuitu, and other similar whimsies. The domain of Mr. Hogsbottom was apparently known simply as the Snuggery, which might have conveyed volumes to a postman schooled in tracking self-effacing citizens to their lairs, but it wasn't a hell of a lot of help to any layman who was trying to find the place for the first time on a dark night. Simon had not walked very far down Greenleaf Road when that fact was brought home to him. Greenleaf Road possessed no street lighting to make navigation easier. It was bordered by hedges of varying heights and densities, behind which lighted windows could sometimes be seen and sometimes not. At intervals, the hedges yawned into gaps which ran well-kept drives and things that looked like cart tracks in about equal proportions. Some of the openings had gates and some had not. Some of the gates had names painted on them, and on those which had, the paint varied in antiquity from shining newness to a state of weather-beaten decomposition, which made any name that had ever been there completely illegible. When the saint realized that they had already passed at least a dozen anonymous entrances, any one of which might have led to the threshold of Mr. Hogsbottom's snuggery, he stopped walking and spoke eloquently on the subject of town planning for a full minute without raising his voice. He could have gone on for longer than that, warming to his subject as he developed the theme, but farther down the road the wobbling light of a lone bicycle blinked into view, and he stepped out from the side of the road as it came abreast of them, and kept his hat down over his eyes and his face averted from the light, while he asked the rider if he knew the home of Hogsbottom. "Yes, sir. Old house on your right, away you're going. Can't miss it," said the wanderer cheerfully, with a native slightly patronizing simplicity, and rode on. The saint paused to light a cigarette and resumed his stride. The lines of his face, dimly illumined in the glow of smoldering tobacco, were sharp with half-humorous anticipation. Hogsbottom may be in London investigating some more nightclubs, he said, but you'd better get a handkerchief tied around your neck so you can pull it up over your dial, just in case. We don't want to be recognized, because it would worry Claude Eustace Teal, and he's busy. He was counting the breaks in the hedges as he walked. He counted 3 and stopped at the 4th. A gate that could have closed it stood open, and he turned his pocket flashlight on it cautiously. It was one of the weather-beaten kind, and the words that had once been painted on it were practically undecipherable. But they looked vaguely as if they might have once stood for the snuggery. Simon killed his torch after that brief glimpse. He dropped his cigarette and trod it out under his foot. "We seem to have arrived," he said. "Now, try not to make too much noise, Hoppy, because maybe Hogsbottom isn't deaf." He drifted on up to the drive as if his shoes had been soled with cotton wool. Following behind him, Mr. Onius's efforts to lighten his tread successfully reduced the total din of their advance to something less than would have been made by a small herd of buffalo. But Simon knew that the average citizen's sense of hearing is mercifully unselective. His own silent movements were more the result of habit than of any conscious care. The drive curved round a dense mass of laurels, above which the symmetrical spires of cypress silhouetted against the dark sky concealed the house until it loomed suddenly in front of him as if it had risen from the ground. The angles of its roofline cut a serrated pattern out of the gauzy backcloth of half-hearted stars hung behind it. The rest of the building below that angled line was merely a mass of solid blackness, in which 1 or 2 knife edges of yellow light, gleaming between drawn curtains, seemed to be suspended disjointedly in space. But they came from ground-floor windows, and he concluded that Ebenezer Hogsbottom was at home. He did not decide that Mr. Hogsbottom was not only at home, but at home with visitors, until he clearly walked into a black closed car parked in the driveway. The car's lights were out, and he was so intent on trying to establish the topography of the lighted windows that the dull sheen of its coachwork barely caught his eye in time for him to check himself. He steered Hoppy round it, and wondered what sort of guest a man with the name and temperament of Ebenezer Hogsbottom would be likely to entertain. And then inside the house, a radio or gramophone began to play. It occurred to Simon he might have been unnecessarily pessimistic in suggesting that Mr. Hogsbottom might not be deaf. From the muffled quality of the noise which reached him, it was obvious that the windows of the room in which the instrument was functioning were tightly closed. But even with that obstruction, the volume of sound which boomed out into the night was startling in its quantity. The opus under execution was the Ride of the Valkyries, which is admittedly not rated among the most ethereal melodies in the musical pharmacopoeia. But even so, it was being produced with a vim which inside the room itself must have been ear-splitting. It roared out in a stunning fortissimo that made the saint put his heels back on the ground and disdain even to moderate his voice. "This is easy," he said. "We'll just batter the door down and walk in." He was not quite as blatant as that, but very nearly. He was careful enough to circle the house to the back door, and whether he would actually have battered it down remained an unanswered question, for he had no need to use any violence on it at all. It opened when he touched the handle, and he stepped in as easily as he had entered the garden. Perhaps it was at this point that he first realized the unplanned embryo of his adventure was taking a twist which he had never expected of it. It was difficult to pin down the exact moment of mutation because it gathered force from a series of shocks, that superimposed themselves on him with a speed that made the separate phases of the change seem somewhat blurred. And the first 2 or 3 of those shocks chased each other into his consciousness directly. That unlatched back door swung inwards under the pressure of his hand. The very fact that the door opened so easily to his exploring touch may have been one of them, but he could take that in his stride. Many householders were inclined to be absent-minded about the use of locks and bolts, but the following blows were harder to swallow. The door opened to give him a clear view of the kitchen, and that was when the rapid sequence of impacts began to make an impression on his powers of absorption. To put it bluntly, which is about the only way anything of that kind could be put, the door opened to give him a full view of what appeared to be quite a personable young woman tied to a chair. There was a subsidiary shock in the realization that she appeared to be personable. Without giving any thought to the subject, Simon had never expected Mr. Hogsbottom to have a servant who was personable. He had automatically credited him with a housekeeper who had stringy mouse-colored hair, a long nose inclined to redness, and a forbidding lipless mouth, a headed in tight-laced corsets, whose egregiously obvious virtue would suffice to strangle any gossip about Mr. Hogsbottom's bachelor menage. Mr. Hogsbottom had to be a bachelor, because it was not plausible that any woman, unless moved by a passion which a man of Mr. Hogsbottom's desiccated sanctity could never hope to inspire, would consent to adopt a name like Mrs. Hogsbottom. The girl in the chair appeared to be moderately young, moderately well-shaped, moderately inoffensive to look at, although the dishcloth, which was knotted across her mouth as a gag, made the last quality a little difficult to estimate. Yet she wore a neat housemaid's uniform, and therefore she presumably belonged to Mr. Hogsbottom's domestic staff. That also could be assimilated with a slightly greater effort. It was her predicament that finally overtaxed his swallowing reflexes. It was possible there might be some self-abnegating soul in the British Isles who was willing to visit with Mr. Hogsbottom. It was possible that Mr. Hogsbottom might be deaf. It was possible he might be careless about locking his back door. It was possible even that he might employ a servant who didn't look like the twin sister of a Gorgon. But if he left her tied up and gagged in the kitchen while he entertained his guests with ear-shattering excerpts from Wagner, there was something irregular going on under his sanctimonious roof which Simon Templar wanted to know more about. He stood staring into the maid's dilated eyes while a galaxy of fantastic queries and surmises skittered across his brain like a grand finale of a firework display. For one long moment, he couldn't have moved or spoken if there had been $1 million bonus for it. Mr. Unius was the one who broke the silence, if any state of affairs that was so numbingly blanketed by the magnified blast of a symphony orchestra could probably be called a silence. He shifted his feet, and his voice grated conspiratorially in the saint's ear. "Is this the old bag, boss?" he inquired with a sepulchral sang-froid, and the interruption brought Simon's reeling imagination back to earth. "What old bag?" he demanded blankly. "Down to Patricia's," said Mr. Unius, with no less blank at even being asked such a question. "Who are we going to bump off?" The saint took a firmer grip of material things. "Does she look like an old bag?" he retorted. Hoppy inspected the exhibit again dispassionately. "No," he admitted. He seemed mystified. Then a solution dawned dazzlingly upon him. "Maybe she has a facelifted, boss," he suggested luminously. "Or maybe she isn't anybody's aunt," Simon pointed out. This kind of extravagant speculation was too much for Mr. Unius. He was unable to gape effectively on account of the handkerchief over his mouth, but the exposed area between the bridge of his nose and the brim of his hat hinted that the rest of his face was gaping. "And maybe we've run into something," said the saint. The rest of his mind was paying no attention to Hoppy's problems. He was not even taking much notice of the maid's panic-stricken eyes as they widened still further in mute terror at the conversation that was passing over her head. He was listening intently to the music that still racketed stridently in his eardrums, 3 times louder now that he was inside the house. There had been a time in the history of his multitudinous interests when he had had a spell of devotion to grand opera, and his ears were as analytically sensitive as those of a trained musician, and he was realizing with a melodramatic suddenness that prickled the hairs on the nape of his neck, that the multisonous shrillness of the Ride of the Valkyries had once been mingled with a brief high-pitched shriek that Wagner had never written into the score. His fingers closed for an instant on Hoppy's arm. "Stay here a minute," he said. He went on past the trussed housemaid out to the door on the far side of the kitchen. The screeching fanfares of music battered at him with redoubled savagery as he opened the door and emerged into the cramped, over-furnished hall beyond it. Aside from its clutter of fretwork mirror mountings, spindly umbrella stands and etceteras, and vapid Victorian chromos, it contained only the lower end of a narrow staircase and 3 other doors, one of which was the front entrance. Simon had subconsciously observed a serving hatch in the wall on his left as he opened the kitchen door, and on that evidence he automatically attributed the left-hand door in the hallway to the dining room. He moved towards the right-hand door, and as he reached it, the music stopped in the middle of a bar as if it had been sheared off with a knife, leaving the whole house stunned with stillness. The saint checked on one foot, abruptly conscious even of his breathing in the sudden quiet. He was less than a yard from the door that must have belonged to the living room. Standing there, he heard the harsh rumble of a thick, brutal voice on the other side of the door, dulled in volume, but perfectly distinct. "All right," it said. "That's just a sample. Now you tell us what you did with that dough. Shall we play some more music?" Oh, that's an excellent cliffhanger to end on things tonight. Yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. We are going to end right there. That cliffhanger. That right there. But of course, right there, yes, and we will pick it up next week. But for now, we need to go find someone to raid. Let's see who we've got here. Let's see if any of my gen mates. I see one. Anyone else? No. Right. Let us go raid Sakura Fubuki, who is playing Final Fantasy XIV online. Looks like just going to be joining in the middle of that. So, punch in the raid code. Before I do that, let me go ahead and plug the links again. The website is lordrexworth.com. Again, lordrexworth.com. That's where you can find all of my links. Do give me a follow on Twitter, twitter.com/LordRexworth. Join the Castle Rexworth Discord. The gates are open. Just click that link in the chat. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, why not leave a tip? It's not required, but it's certainly appreciated. You can support me directly with a donation via Stream Elements. The link is in the chat. Also, got Throne page. Gifts always appreciated, but never required by His Lordship. Just check out my Throne page at throne.com/LordRexworth. Also got the Throne-powered shop. Support His Lordship through purchases of items specially curated by me at the Throne shop, lordrexworth.store. That is, lordrexworth.store. And with that, we're going to punch in our raid code for Sakura Fubuki. And let me get that copy pasta in place for you. There we have it. All right, everyone. I shall not see you tomorrow, but I will see you Sunday for Sanctus Ecclesia and continuing gameplay of Resident Evil 5 with Celeste Altair. So see you all Sunday. Until then, I'm Lord Rexworth, wishing you all the best, and God bless.